The Elridge house stood at the edge of a forest that locals avoided, its walls gray and weathered, shadows clinging to the corners like living things. Generations had passed, yet the stories remained. Every son born in that house bore a mark. It wasn't a birthmark, nor a scar from some childhood accident. It was something else entirely, something the doctors could never explain. Claw-like and unnerving, it traced the inside of the wrist in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, as though something outside the family had reached in to claim its inheritance. The story of the Elridge mark began quietly, almost innocuously, buried in records that most people would have dismissed without a second thought. In the dimly lit archives of the county hall, a historian named Samuel Thorne was sifting through centuries of birth registers, noting patterns in families that had long since faded from local memory. The Elridges were always there, listed consistently through decades, and at first glance, there was nothing unusual. They were a quiet, insular family, rarely seen at village gatherings, their house set back against the edge of the forest as though it were deliberately hiding. It wasn't until Thorne noticed the annotations beside the names of every male child that he began to feel a creeping unease. Doctors, midwives, and even village priests had written the same cryptic phrase repeatedly: "Mark observed at birth. Unexplained." There were no medical explanations, no historical context, only that brief, unnerving note, as if whoever recorded it had known something the rest of the world could not comprehend. Thorne began to cross-reference the dates, the births, and the locations, comparing them with neighboring families. He expected some irregularity, a rash, a congenital birthmark, or perhaps a family tradition that involved tattoos, but nothing matched the oddity described in the records. Each male child carried a small, claw-like indentation on the inner wrist, almost perfectly shaped, always appearing in the same spot. Doctors had speculated it might be a genetic mutation, midwives called it a strange birthmark, but no one had ever seen anything like it elsewhere in the county. As he dug deeper, Thorne discovered that the mark was only ever present in sons, never daughters, and that the phenomenon had persisted for at least 3 centuries. The implication was chilling. This was not a simple family quirk or a matter of coincidence. The mark was deliberate, consistent, and yet wholly inexplicable. In the margins of one particularly old register, there was a faded note written in the spidery handwriting of an 18th-century physician, warning that the mark was not of human origin and urging that the children be kept safe. Thorne's curiosity morphed into something darker as he continued through the dusty records, realizing that every generation of Elridge men had carried the same mark from the moment of birth. The more he looked, the more he felt the weight of centuries pressing down, a kind of invisible thread connecting each child to the one before, stretching back into a past no one had dared to fully explore. Something about the repetition, the precision, and the unexplained nature of the mark suggested that the Elridge family had been bound to a force beyond understanding, and that this force had waited patiently, silently observing, for each new son to arrive, ensuring that the legacy would endure in ways no one could predict. Thorne could feel it in the chill of the archive, in the musty scent of old paper, and in the subtle tremor of unease that crept up his spine as he turned to the next page, wondering just how far this mysterious phenomenon extended through time. Samuel Thorne continued his research into the birth records of the Elridge family. A lead appeared that pulled him far beyond the sterile pages of official registers and into the shadowed corners of the family's own history. During a visit to the old Elridge estate, now largely abandoned and overgrown with ivy, he discovered a forgotten attic, its door hidden behind a rotting armoire and sealed with decades of dust. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, and stacks of brittle journals lay scattered across the floor, their leather covers cracked and warped with age. The handwriting inside was erratic, the pages filled with fevered observations, strange sketches, and notes that hinted at rituals, omens, and a lineage that seemed almost otherworldly. The diaries belonged to ancestors long since passed, men and women who had chronicled not only the births of each male child, but also the odd circumstances surrounding them. One entry, dated to the late 1700s, described the first known appearance of the mark in vivid detail, referring to it as a claw of the unseen, and warning that the mark carried with it a bond to forces beyond human reckoning. The language was archaic and unsettling, filled with phrases like "the watchers beyond the trees" and "the blood remembers what the mind forgets," suggesting a connection between the Elridges and something ancient, patient, and observant. Thorne traced the lineage through the journals, noting a disturbing pattern. Each generation had been warned not to speak of the mark, not to venture into the forest after sunset, and never to leave the family line unbroken, as though the continuation of the Elridge bloodline was the key to a covenant made long ago. Some entries described eerie occurrences, faint whispers in empty rooms, shadows that moved against the grain of light, and dreams so vivid that they seemed to bleed into waking life. The journals hinted that the mark was more than physical, that it was a symbol of allegiance or possession, placed upon each son to mark him as part of a contract whose terms no living person could negotiate. Thorne read on, heart racing, as one particularly aged journal recounted the story of a boy who had vanished after ignoring his mother's warnings, leaving only deep scratches on the floorboards and the faint smell of sulfur in the air. The diaries suggested that the Elridges were not merely a family under observation, but a family bound to something that required their obedience, their sons, and their silence. Each page Thorne turned felt heavier than the last, the warnings and confessions layered upon one another like sediment, forming a geological record of fear and ritual. The historian realized that the journals were not merely records of past events. They were guides, warnings, and testimonies of a secret carried forward through centuries, revealing that the mark was the outward sign of an invisible covenant, and that the forest, the house, and the bloodline itself were all instruments in a story far darker than anyone outside the Elridge family could imagine. The disappearance of the latest Elridge son marked the point where the family's history shifted from whispered rumor into undeniable terror. It began one night in late October, when the wind carried a sharp, icy bite through the skeletal branches of the forest that hugged the edge of the Elridge property. Young Caleb, only 8 years old, had been asleep in his upstairs room, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His mother, Eleanor, had checked on him several times before retiring herself, noting nothing unusual except the faint scratching sound that had been heard in the house for generations, dismissed by the adults as imagination or old wood settling. When morning came, Caleb was gone. His bed was neatly made, the small blanket tucked under his chin, but the boy was nowhere to be found. Panic gripped the family, but it was not the frantic confusion of an ordinary disappearance. The air in the house was thick, heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath, and a faint odor lingered, a metallic tang with a hint of sulfur, the same scent noted in decades-old journals documenting past disappearances. On the ground outside Caleb's window were deep scratches, claw-like in their pattern, leading from the edge of the forest and disappearing into the trees. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises the night before, whispers that seemed to echo Caleb's own voice, faint laughter that carried across the fog-laden fields, and the sensation of being watched, even from a distance. Local authorities were called, but there was no sign of struggle, no footprints apart from the scratches leading into the darkened forest, and no clues as to where the boy might have gone. Samuel Thorne, who had been documenting the Elridge lineage, arrived the same morning, drawn by the familiar pattern in the records he had studied for months. As he examined the marks in the dirt, a shiver ran through him. They were precise, deliberate, almost ritualistic, echoing the descriptions in the centuries-old diaries. The pattern suggested the boy had not merely wandered off, but had been taken, guided by an unseen presence. The village was awash with unease, recalling stories of prior Elridge sons who had vanished only to return changed, or never return at all. Eleanor, frantic and sleepless, spoke of hearing Caleb's voice at odd hours, calling softly from the shadows of the forest, too faint to locate, but unmistakably real. Every instinct screamed that this was not a typical child's disappearance, that the mark Caleb bore was more than a symbol, it was a calling. The house itself seemed to respond, doors creaking, floorboards groaning, and the scratching sounds recurring with an almost sentient rhythm, as if echoing Caleb's absence. Thorne realized, with mounting dread, that the lineage he had been studying was not merely cursed in theory. The disappearance confirmed that the mark was an active link, a tether to forces outside comprehension, and that every warning in the old diaries had been literal rather than metaphorical, hinting at a terror that would not rest until it had claimed its due. After Caleb's disappearance, the villagers became uneasy in ways they had never been before. The forest that had long bordered the Elridge property, once ignored or dismissed as merely dense and unwelcoming, seemed suddenly alive with movements that were never quite human. Shadows stretched and shifted in impossible ways beneath the skeletal branches, and a faint whispering followed anyone who dared to approach the tree line after dusk. People reported hearing voices, low, coaxing, and eerily familiar, carrying through the fog, often sounding like the very children who had been born into the Elridge family. Some swore they had seen figures crouched among the trees, human in silhouette, but with proportions that seemed wrong. Limbs too long, heads tilted at unnatural angles, faces obscured by darkness that did not behave as ordinary shadows should. Farmers returning from evening chores claimed to hear footsteps trailing them, yet when they turned, the forest appeared empty. Dogs refused to enter the woods, growling at invisible presences and whimpering when forced near the tree line. Samuel Thorne, now deeply involved with the investigation, decided to observe the forest at night, hoping to understand whether these reports were exaggerated or grounded in some tangible reality. He watched from a small hill that overlooked the property, the fog curling between the trees like living smoke. Around 11 o'clock, movement caught his eye. Figures pacing silently, pausing as though listening, their gestures deliberate yet inhuman. Thorne's heart pounded as he realized that these were not ordinary villagers or wanderers. They were something else, something tethered to the Elridge house and its cursed bloodline. On several nights, the figures seemed to follow one another in a ritualistic path, tracing a circuit around the perimeter of the property and disappearing only when the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The villagers began reporting dreams that mirrored what was seen in the forest. Children speaking in voices that were not their own, shadows moving independently of light, and the sensation of being watched from just beyond sight. At times, Thorne heard the whispers clearly, words that seemed both a warning and an invitation, carrying the cadence of young Caleb's own voice. Local superstition grew, and some families avoided traveling near the Elridge property entirely, while others refused to speak of it, fearful that mentioning the forest would draw the unseen closer. The aura of menace surrounding the house and woods became palpable, a living, breathing force that seemed to bend perception, twisting normal sounds and shapes into forms designed to terrify. It became apparent that the forest itself was no longer merely a boundary but a stage, and the strange, almost spectral visitors were actors in a centuries-old play in which the Elridge children were both participants and prey. Thorne recognized that these sightings were not isolated incidents or figments of imagination. They were tied directly to the curse of the mark, a presence waiting in the shadows, watching, listening, and ready to claim whatever belonged to it next. As the forest's presence grew more oppressive and the whispers of the missing children reached fevered levels of speculation, Samuel Thorne realized that understanding the Elridge curse required more than folklore and archival research. It demanded science. Desperate to determine whether there was a tangible explanation behind the mark that plagued the Elridge sons, Thorne sought the expertise of a geneticist, Dr. Lydia Marrow, a specialist in rare hereditary mutations. When she examined blood samples collected from the family over generations, she found anomalies that confounded modern science. The sequences carried fragments of DNA that did not match any known human lineage, patterns that suggested an inheritance beyond ordinary biology, a coded signature that seemed deliberately preserved across centuries. Every male Elridge exhibited the same deviations, each echoing the one before with an unbroken consistency, as if the blood itself remembered its own origin. Dr. Marrow grew increasingly uneasy as she cross-referenced the data, noting sequences that bore resemblance to certain theoretical models of hybridized or non-terrestrial genetic material, speculative, controversial, and impossible to fully verify. She explained to Thorne that while mutations could appear in isolated cases, the exact repetition of these unusual sequences through every male generation defied natural explanation. There were subtle markers embedded in the genetic code that suggested a sort of conscious design, as if some intelligence had ensured the persistence of the anomaly. Thorne began to understand that the mark was not merely a superficial sign. It was the outward manifestation of a bloodline already altered at its core. The realization was chilling. The Elridges were biologically distinct, and the curse that had haunted them for centuries was encoded deep within their very cells. As the two of them continued testing, Dr. Marrow uncovered another startling discovery. The anomalous sequences seemed to activate under certain environmental triggers. Stress, exposure to specific natural elements from the forest surrounding the Elridge property, and even emotional states of the males correlated with subtle changes in the expression of these sequences, suggesting a link between the family's physiology and the mysterious events in the forest. Thorne considered the implications, his mind racing. If the mark was only the surface of a far deeper alteration, then the curse was not something external merely symbolized by scars and whispers. It was inherent, a living, unbreakable part of the Elridge bloodline. It explained the consistency of the disappearances, the influence the forest seemed to exert, and the terrifying precision of the entity's claims over the sons. The evidence suggested that no Elridge man could truly escape what he had inherited, that the forest and its spectral agents were merely the outward enforcement of a biological legacy beyond comprehension. The house, the woods, the whispers, and the claw-like marks on each wrist were not isolated phenomena. They were manifestations of a hidden design, a lineage altered and preserved for centuries, and every new generation carried the same encoded bond, a living proof that the curse was as scientific as it was supernatural. By the time the eldest living Elridge son, Jonathan, reached 23, the weight of his family's history had become almost unbearable. He had grown up hearing the whispers of the past, feeling the pull of the mark on his wrist, and witnessing the fear that haunted his mother and sisters. Unlike the others, Jonathan refused to remain passive, convinced that if he could confront whatever had claimed the sons of his family for centuries, he might finally break the cycle. On a moonless night, he packed only essentials, leaving behind the safety of the house that had both nurtured and imprisoned him. His path led straight into the forest, the same shadowed expanse that had claimed so many before him, the trees looming like sentinels in the inky darkness. Each step felt heavier than the last, the underbrush whispering against his legs, the wind carrying hints of voices that mimicked his own name. Every instinct urged him to turn back, yet he pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear, determination, and the unshakable belief that knowledge was his only weapon. The deeper he went, the more the world seemed to shift around him. Familiar sounds warped into distorted echoes, and shadows took on shapes that defied reason. Shapes crouched in the darkness, eyes glinting with unnatural light, watching, judging, waiting. Jonathan could feel the presence of the entity, a pulsing awareness that seemed to synchronize with the very mark he carried. The closer he drew to the heart of the forest, the more intense the sensation became, as if the being could sense his resolve and intended to test it. Hours passed, or perhaps mere minutes, for time seemed irrelevant within the forest's grip, and Jonathan came upon a clearing where the ground was scarred with the same claw-like patterns that had accompanied past disappearances. The air was thick, almost viscous, and carried the smell of sulfur and iron, familiar from stories long whispered among the villagers. In the center of the clearing, the shadows coalesced into a shape that was at once vaguely human and undeniably alien, a mass of sinew and intent, its presence both mesmerizing and repulsive. The entity spoke without words, its voice a resonance inside Jonathan's mind rather than through his ears, repeating phrases from the old journals he had studied as a boy, phrases warning of obedience, lineage, and inheritance. Jonathan felt the weight of every son who had come before him, their fates pressing against his consciousness. He realized that this confrontation was not merely physical, but spiritual and psychological, testing his resolve, his courage, and his understanding of the bloodline he carried. Every heartbeat felt synchronized with the forest, the entity's attention fixed entirely on him. It became clear that the forest, the house, and the mark on his wrist were all extensions of the same force, and that confronting it would require more than bravery. It would demand insight, cunning, and the willingness to face a truth that generations of Elridges had been too fearful to acknowledge. The night deepened, shadows stretched and twisted, and Jonathan stepped forward, fully aware that he was no longer a visitor in the forest, but a participant in an ancient and unyielding covenant that had been waiting for him, in the heart of the forest. Jonathan finally confronted the entity that had haunted his family for centuries, and the truth revealed itself in a way that was more horrifying than any story or legend could convey. The shape before him was fluid yet monstrous, shifting in the dim light between forms that were vaguely human and others that were grotesquely alien. Its eyes, or the closest semblance of eyes, glimmered with intelligence, predation, and a cruel amusement that chilled Jonathan to his core. The whispers from the trees, the scratches on the earth, the uncanny sightings by villagers, all were extensions of this presence, manifestations of a force that had patiently watched over the Elridge bloodline, waiting for each son to arrive. As Jonathan approached, he felt the mark on his wrist pulse, as if acknowledging the entity's awareness of him. The being's presence was invasive, filling his mind with visions of every Elridge son who had ever lived, their lives shaped, guided, and ultimately claimed by its influence. It was then that the horrifying truth became undeniable. The mark was not a passive symbol, nor was it merely a curse to frighten the family. It was a binding, a literal claim on every male descendant, ensuring that the entity's hold could never be broken. The claw-like scar on each son's wrist was a sigil of ownership, a reminder that the Elridge men had been, and would always be, part of a lineage claimed by something beyond human comprehension. Jonathan understood that the disappearances, the voices in the forest, and the inescapable feeling of being watched were all carefully orchestrated mechanisms to reinforce this bond. The entity spoke directly into his consciousness, revealing fragments of its purpose, its desires, and the logic that had sustained its influence over the centuries. It had no malice in the human sense, only an unyielding insistence that the lineage continue under its oversight. Jonathan saw visions of newborn sons, the mark appearing immediately upon birth, each generation feeding into the same ancient pact, ensuring that the force remained tethered to the human world. He realized that attempts to flee, to resist, or to defy the entity had always been futile. The forest, the house, and the mark itself acted as instruments of a design far beyond mortal understanding. Fear, dread, and awe combined into a weight pressing on his chest as the being demonstrated, through a series of visions, how each Elridge had been influenced, shaped, and sometimes lost to it entirely. Every instinct in Jonathan screamed to turn and run, yet he understood that knowledge alone would not free him. The entity had existed for centuries, patient and meticulous, and it would not relent. It was neither good nor evil in human terms. It simply was, and its claim over the Elridge sons was absolute. Jonathan now faced the stark reality that the lineage he had hoped to save was irrevocably bound, and that the mark he bore was a living testament to the relentless, incomprehensible force that had patiently awaited each generation, ensuring that the Elridge bloodline could never escape its invisible chains. The final, chilling revelation came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the months following Jonathan's confrontation with the entity. Life around the Elridge estate continued, yet the sense of normalcy was fragile, like a thin layer of ice over a dark, shifting current. Jonathan had returned from the forest, carrying not triumph but the heavy weight of understanding, a knowledge that the mark on his wrist was not a curse he could remove, nor a force he could defeat. It was a part of him, an inheritance older than the house, older than the village itself. The family tried to continue their lives, but the mark persisted, pulsing faintly beneath the skin of every male who bore it, a constant reminder that the forest, the entity, and the bloodline were intertwined in ways that could never be undone. Then, as if to reaffirm the unbroken chain, a new Elridge child was born. The birth was ordinary in every other sense. The cries of the newborn, the joy of the family, and the ritual of welcoming a new life. But the moment the infant's tiny wrist was examined, the familiar claw-like mark was already there, vivid and undeniable. Those who saw it felt the same cold dread that had haunted the Elridge estate for generations. The mark, they realized, was not a temporary anomaly or the result of human error. It was a living imprint of the entity's influence, a symbol of ownership and continuity. Even as the infant slept, the house seemed to acknowledge the arrival of the new heir, the walls creaking and sighing as though aware of the continuation of a cycle that had spanned centuries. Jonathan watched silently, a mixture of sorrow and resignation weighing on him. He understood that nothing he could do would break the lineage. The mark, the forest, and the entity's presence would remain as constant as the blood flowing through his family's veins. Villagers, already wary of the estate, whispered that the cycle would continue, that the entity had claimed its next generation, and that the forest would remain vigilant, patient, and unrelenting. The infant's birth reaffirmed a terrifying truth. The covenant between the Elridge bloodline and the unseen force was eternal, binding, and meticulously maintained. As the family tried to settle into a semblance of peace, the entity's influence lingered in subtle ways. The way shadows clung longer than natural to the corners of the rooms, the occasional whisper that seemed to echo the infant's coos, the faint, inexplicable scratches on the floorboards in the dead of night. Jonathan realized that the legacy of the Elridge clan was not merely a matter of family history, but a living, breathing chain of possession, one that began the moment a son was born and would endure indefinitely. Every precaution, every hope, and every attempt at resistance could not alter what had already been set in motion. The mark, the forest, and the entity were not anomalies to be corrected. They were the foundation of a truth that spanned centuries, a truth that ensured the Elridge sons would forever carry the weight of their inheritance, and that the curse, if it could even be called that, would continue to shape the lives of generations yet to come.